wonderful opportunity today to hear from Kaelin Jewell. So Carol Tinkelman's going to introduce Kaelin.
Okay, so I virtually met Kaelin this past May, along with a few of other of our MSAP members. We took this terrific course virtually throughout the month of May. I think it was 4 sessions on Fridays from 1 to 4 or something like that, about mosaics in Ravenna and also in other places in the ancient world. And Kaelin can correct all the mistakes I make. So I just have a little bio for her that I'm going to read to you, that she's an archaeologically trained art historian who earned her PhD in art history from Temple University's Tyler School of Art. Her research focuses on visual culture of the late Roman and Byzantine worlds, and has been supported by institutions like the International Center for Medieval Art. Since 2018, Kaelin has been part of the Department of Research, Interpretation, and Education at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, where she teaches classes on that focus on both the permanent collection and the wider history of art. In addition to her role at the Barnes, Kaelin serves as an art historical consultant for the Stanford University-sponsored underwater archaeology project based in the Sicilian town of Marzamemi, which I can't wait to go see. And we are very excited to have her as our presenter.
I just want to start by thanking everybody involved with the Mosaic Society of Philadelphia for, number one, taking my class. That was so fun having you guys in there. And also for inviting me today to speak to your members. This is a great opportunity, I think, to demonstrate how the Barnes, I'm really proud of the Barnes for kind of getting out of, moving beyond the world of modern art. It's fun being the kind of the specialist in the old stuff in the collection. So I'm so glad that you all have taken advantage. And I forgot to put stuff on here, but I would encourage you all to look at our list of classes for the spring. They're already up. I'm teaching a class on the ancient world. I'll be teaching a semester-long class called The Elements of Art. And next summer, I'll be teaching either the Ravenna class again, or maybe a class on Greek art or mosaics. I haven't really decided yet, but just be sure to check the Barnes website. I've included my email here in case any of you would like to get in touch with me. Feel free to shoot me an email. More than happy to chat with people and answer further questions. And so this is a photograph of me sitting in a rock-cut church in Cappadocia. It's from the 6th century. And yeah, as Carol nicely said, I am an archaeologically trained art historian. So when I look at mosaics or when I look at buildings and I study them from the perspective of somebody who's dug lots of holes in the ground. So I think about them in very material ways. And there's some information, if you're more interested in the Stanford project, feel free to check it out. Marzamemi is indeed one of the great places in the world. Okay, so I wanted to start by showing you, so the sort of theme of my talk today will be basically a sort of travel through the mosaics of Byzantium, starting with early ones and then ending with late ones. And we're going to be going on a very quick whirlwind tour of Byzantium through its mosaics. And I wanted to start at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And some of you may have been there before. What we're seeing here in this photograph is the current building that's standing there today. And if we go to the next slide, we can see, oh, there we go. Yeah, so this is what it looks like on the inside for those of you who have yet to sneak off to Rome and check out St. Peter's. But what some of you might not know is that underneath it, there are a whole series of archaeological sites that are underneath that modern building, or the 16th. It's modern to me because I work on like ancient stuff. But the 16th century building underneath it, there are archaeological sites, including, so if you go to the next slide, we can see a floor plan. So the yellow in this floor plan is the building that is standing today that was built in the Renaissance, based on designs by Bramante and Michelangelo. And the smaller the smaller inset there with the kind of brownish color, the brownish reddish color, that is the original building that was built by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. And Constantine is important for this discussion of Byzantium because he is the first emperor to legalize Christianity. And when he does so, he starts to build all of these churches across the Roman Empire, Christian churches. And the way that they are decorated is very traditional in terms of how you would decorate a Roman sacred space. And, one of the most important media for that was mosaic. Earlier in the Roman Empire, mosaic was mostly used for the floors. I'm sure this is not news to any of you guys, but mosaic was normally used on the floor. And then by the time we get into this late antique period after the era of Constantine, mosaics really start to make these inroads up the walls and onto the vaults of buildings. And one of the great things about a lot of these churches is that there are a bunch of them that survive. And so we've got some great examples of mosaics that are decorating some of these early sacred spaces. So one of those early spaces is underneath St. Peter's Basilica. So if we go to the next slide, we can see a couple of photographs here. So they're the same, it's the same place. On the left is a view up into a small vault. It's a very small little room. It's known as the Tomb of the Julii. And on the vault, the apex of the vault, you can see that, and this inset color image here, you can see these grapevines against a gold background. You also have this guy on a chariot. He's holding a little blue orb, and he's got a couple of horses. There would have been 2 more on the other side. And this is an image of Christ. This is an early image of Christ. It dates from the 3rd century, so the 200s. And the image is remarkable because it's one of the earliest images of Christ that we have in the city of Rome. And the way that he is represented through the medium of mosaic is not as a kind of a martyr on a cross that we might think of Christ being mostly represented later on in the Middle Ages or even today, but instead he is a triumphant, almost emperor-like figure who is very connected in his imagery to images of the sun god Helios. So it's a really interesting moment in the history of religion where you start to have these early Christians utilizing the art making techniques and the iconographies of the pagan world. So it's one of the many reasons why I love studying this time period. If we fast forward and go to the next slide and move into the city of Constantinople, which you see a reconstruction of the great palace complex here, most of this is no longer surviving. Those of you who maybe have been to Istanbul maybe have been in the area that corresponds to the hippodrome, so that kind of open area on the left of this image. Perhaps you've probably been to Hagia Sophia, which we'll look at in a couple of minutes. But what this kind of crazy diagram, this reconstruction shows is the extent of the Imperial palace complex in Constantinople. So when Constantine moves the capital in the 330s, around the 330s, he moves the capital from the city of Rome to Constantinople. He names the city after himself. So he names it the city of Constantine, Constantinopolis. And in doing so, he sets up a new Rome. So Constantinople is often referred to as Nova Roma. So if we go to the next image, we've got some wonderful highly fragmentary examples of the mosaics from the early period. These have variously been dated from the 4th to the 6th centuries. Some of this might have been laid down during the era of Constantine. Some of it might have been laid down during the era of Justinian the Great. But in any case, these date to the early years of the so-called Byzantine Empire, which is kind of the Eastern successor to what was the classical Roman Empire. This is a space that is now known as the Great Palace Mosaic Museum. I imagine those of you who've been to Istanbul have probably been to the museum. There are a number of really great examples of mosaics that decorated the floor of one of these buildings in the Great Palace complex. So if you go to the next image, we can just look at a couple of these. Yeah, so these are so classical looking, right? I mean, these look like wall paintings. Notice how fine the tesserae are. The individual little tessera on the face of the figure, they're so tiny. And you can see how, as you kind of radiate out from that face, the tesserae get larger. So I think it's a really interesting insight into the technique of these artists, and the use of very small tesserae for facial features or areas of detail, with larger tesserae for backgrounds or kind of ornamental borders. That is something very Roman. We know that the kind of earlier centuries of the Roman Empire, artists were doing that. And if we go to the next image, what we can see is the use of these mosaics. This is from the same complex. The use of these mosaics as ways to display the power and authority of the imperial court. So imagine being a person walking into this space. And if we go to the next image, seeing these really kinds of graphic images of animals eating other animals. There are also, and I didn't bring them in because this presentation would have been like 8 days long, but images of people hunting animals, images of animals attacking people. So there's all of this kind of violence that is on display. But imagine being a visitor to the imperial palace of the emperors in Byzantine Constantinople and walking along these floors. This would have been a very intimidating experience. And so these images rendered in mosaic are meant to be propagandistic. They're meant to intimidate the viewer. Let's switch gears a little bit and move to the city of Ravenna. So again, as Carol mentioned, several of your members were in my romp through Ravenna, which was so much fun. I imagine a number of you have probably been to Ravenna, visited the famous school that is there. I had the absolute pleasure of visiting Ravenna numerous times and doing research there. And what a lovely, lovely place. For those of you who have not yet been, add it to your list. And if we go forward, we can see here, and I'm just going to show you a few examples from Ravenna, because as Carol mentioned, you can spend a lifetime talking about these mosaics. This is one of them. This is a set of mosaics that was installed inside a palace chapel that was built by the Ostrogothic king, Theodoric the Great. And he was a man who was very much an outsider in terms of the Byzantine Empire. But as a young child, he had been captured during a raid, and he was kidnapped and taken to the court in Constantinople, where he was raised. And so he was raised among all of the fineries and the mosaic decorations and everything that was in Constantinople. And so when he goes back to Ravenna and sets up his capital there, when he becomes king of the Ostrogoths, as he called himself, he builds a palace chapel. So he was a Christian, and inside the palace chapel, he had it decorated with a series of very fabulous mosaics. And if we go to the next image, so whenever I go to Ravenna, I always end up taking the same series of photographs of this moment when the light is coming through the western windows and casting this beautiful reflections, or it's creating these beautiful reflections from the gold that is present in these mosaics. And so you can see the individual outlines here of all of these standing saints. So on one side, you have an image of male saints processing down the nave, and on the other side, you have female saints, and they're processing from different spots. So if we go to the next image, you can see that we've got the male saints emanating from this little inset image of the palace. So this is an image of Theodoric's palace. Now, originally, where you see, for instance, in the center where there's that gold field and the curtains are kind of drawn back, or all of the curtains that are present here in general, originally, so around the year 500, those spaces between the columns would have had images of people. Those people were removed after Theodoric died and his court was conquered. And what the new Byzantine authorities did was that they removed those images of the earlier court and they put up these images of textiles instead as a way to kind of thumb their nose and kind of demonstrate the power of this erasure. They decided to leave just the hands of some of the figures. So I show you a little detail here of one of those hands that remains on one of the columns. So it's this concept of what is known as damnatio memoriae, the erasure of the memory of people. So this is something that the ancient Romans did. This is something that the early medievals did as well. If we go to the next image, we'll move into a different building. So a little bit later, built about 20 years or so later, the Church of San Vitale, which is my Zoom background right now. And San Vitale really has the most, if we go to the next image, really has the best examples of absolutely top-notch, top-tier mosaics in the city of Ravenna. Nothing really matches what we have in San Vitale. So here's a detail showing you the area of the building that has the mosaic. And what we see here in the app, so this is the area that covers the space where the altar is located. So the liturgical ceremonies would happen in this space. And what you have is Christ, a very youthful looking beardless Christ, sitting on top of a blue orb representative of the world. He's holding a scroll, which is meant to be the scrolls of Revelation. He's holding a martyr's crown that he's giving to an image of Saint Vitalis, who is the patron saint of this building. And below him, there are 4 rivers of paradise that are emanating out of, essentially out of the area where his feet are, so at the bottom of that globe. And then if we go to the next image, sort of crowning this whole space is an image of paradise. And you can see at the very center, so I've pulled in an inset here so you can see the center. Those of you who've been there know it's a very overwhelming experience to be standing in this space. And at the very apex of this little vaulted area, it's not little, it's pretty big, this vaulted area is this image of the Lamb of God. So all of this has connotations back with New Testament readings. There are also Old Testament stories that are being told through the medium of mosaic. But if we go to the next image, the most famous examples of these of the mosaics that are inside San Vitale are indicated here in these 2 red arrows. And if we go to the next, we can see details of the 2 of them. So here they are. These are the most famous mosaics, probably from the history of art. In maybe some of those Roman ones, like the trash mosaics, the floor mosaics, those are pretty amazing too. But these are really kind of an important point in the history of art. On the left, we have an image of the Emperor Justinian. On the right, we have an image of his wife, the Empress Theodora, and they're surrounded by their retinues, their attendants, the clergy. And it's these mosaics with their otherworldly gold background. They're standing on grass, but it's not really clear where these spaces are. They're sort of inhabiting a space between this world and the next, kind of a comment on the power of the emperor and the empress. And if we go to the next image, so here's a great detail of the 2 of them. We'll go to the next one. We know that in the at the turn of the 20th century, a number of photographs were taken of these mosaics and they were distributed. And so all of a sudden in the early 20th century, these sites became essentially portable. And so you started to have people from all over the world wanting to start to visit San Vitale to see these mosaics. And so it's these types of images that circulated that made their way all the way up to Northern Europe. If you go to the next image, we can see here Gustav Klimt's very famous painting, The Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer from 1907. And we know very specifically that he is modeling portions of Adele Bloch-Bauer, specifically on the image of Theodora. And that kind of mosaic-like aesthetic that we see in Gustav Klimt's works, especially in this period around 1907, is very much connected to his travels to San Vitale. So he went to Ravenna specifically to see these images of Justinian and Theodora. So, and there are there's a whole bunch more I could say about that. But let's kind of move forward. So we're still in Ravenna. We are in a site that is located just outside of the city of Ravenna in what was the ancient port city known as Clase, and another building that was built by the same person who had built San Vitale. This was constructed in 549. This is the Church of Santa Paulinari in Clase. And when we look at a detail of the apse mosaic, if we go to the next image. Yeah. So here we can see a representation in this apse mosaic of another blue orb, but instead of having Christ sitting on it, instead what we have is a cross inscribed within it. And within that cross, you have all of these little stars. And at the very center of that cross, you have a very tiny little portrait of the head of Christ. Notice that Christ here has a beard, whereas the Christ that we looked at San Vitale did not have a beard. So it's an interesting choice that these artists are making. Christ in this early period does not always have to have a beard. He does not always have to be that kind of scraggly, long-haired, bearded guy. That doesn't come until later. The rest of this image here, you've got an image of a figure standing in a orant pose. So he's in a position of prayer, surrounded by images of paradise. These lambs are representative of the apostles. And so this is a moment that is representing what is known as the Transfiguration. And this comes from the gospel stories, the moment when Christ reveals his divinity to his followers. Let's go to the next image and travel. Oh yeah, and I did want to show you this. Okay, so at the area of the mosaic, at the band at the bottom, during conservation of the mosaics, which is sort of an ongoing process in these ancient buildings, it was discovered the synopia, so the underdrawing, which was done usually with some kind of a red earth or a red ochre kind of pigment, and it was kind of brushed on, and then you guys are mosaic artists, so you know how it works. But we have the synopia that survives from the church. And what's fascinating when you compare the synopia, the underdrawing, to what actually survives in the building, it's different. So we know that the artist or the patron or a combination of the two had decided to change their minds. The design changed. So it's a really, really fascinating little glimpse into the working processes of these artists. Okay, let's move. Okay, so now we're going down to Egypt. And we're going to the site of the Monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. So if we go to the next image, you can get a sense of the kind of fabulousness of place. So this is the Monastery of St. Catherine. It was built by the Emperor Justinian in the 540s, so right at the end of his life. He died in 565. And one of these buildings within this fortified monastery is a church dedicated to the Theotokos, or the God-bearer, the Greek term for the Virgin Mary. And when we go inside, if we go to the next image, we can see an interior view and also a detail of the apse. So the photograph on the left is showing you the doors open, looking into the church. And what you see on the right is the area of the apse. And you can see the canopies of the altar down below. And this is still a monastery. It's a place that you can go visit. I mean, after this pandemic ends someday, you can go visit the monks at Sinai. And if we go to the next image, you can see a comparison. It seems unlikely at first, a comparison between these two images, but the subject matter is the same. So it sounds Paulinari and Clase. It's an image of the Transfiguration. It's also an image of the Transfiguration on Sinai. And what's pretty fabulous about this is that they're made right around the same time, and they are showing the levels of creativity and the kind of the looseness with which these artists can kind of work within. So these two images rendered very differently in mosaic. Let's continue forward. Let's march on. Oh yeah, and also at Sinai, there's some really great examples of what we call optical color blending. So something we usually associate with pixels, modern pixels, or even maybe with the pointillist technique of the late 19th century of artists like Georges Seurat. But we had mosaic artists. If you go to the next slide, we have mosaic artists in places all across the late antique Mediterranean, making use of these different colored mosaics, putting them together so that when you're standing far away from them or standing down below and these are hovering up above you, they blend into these purple colors, for example, as you see here. It's a really, really cool example of that. We can go to the next one. Okay, so traveling for just like a hot second back up to the Northern Adriatic to a place called Porridge. If we go to the next image, we can see an exterior view and an interior view of a fabulous little church that is known as the Basilica of Bishop Euphrasis. It's in the city of Porridge, which is a lovely little town in coastal Croatia on the Istrian Peninsula. This dates to around the same time as all of these churches we've been talking about. And if you go to the next image, you can see here the really fabulous use of mosaic and the variegations that these artists are utilizing or are exploiting. So the way that the mosaics, notice, for example, the halos around the female martyrs that are represented here. So we've got Saint Cecilia, we've got Saint Agnes, Saint Eugenia, and there is a difference in the way that the shine from the gold it's shinier and brighter next to their heads, and then it kind of sort of dissolves away. And this was achieved, it's all gold mosaic, those halos, the background, it's all gold, but they're using different angles at which the tesserae are actually embedded into the plaster. And so they're taking advantage of light coming in through windows and creating these kind of otherworldly effects with the gold mosaic. And this is mosaic that has gold leaf on the back, as I'm sure you guys probably already know. Okay, let's go to the next. And here's another example of that. Really, really great images. Okay, so moving to Constantinople, you can go ahead and go to the next image. Moving to Constantinople, moving to the Church of Hagia Sophia, fabulous building built by the architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidorus of Miletus. It was built in 5 years, which is so crazy to me. If we go inside, you can see here, and those of you who maybe have been to Istanbul and have been to Hagia Sophia know how transformative this space is. And part of the transformational experience of it is, okay, number one, it's all the windows. So it's a very porous building, but also all of those windows letting in all of the light that is then bouncing off of all of the gold mosaic that's in there. So all of this sort of yellow that you see here originally in the Byzantine period would have been gold mosaic. And a number of those gold mosaics do survive, which we'll see in a few minutes. So let's go to the next image. So here's a detail showing you the porousness of this building is not just in the windows, but notice the lacy quality, the lace-like texture of these column capitals. So we're talking about a very different kind of space than an ancient Roman heavy austere space. This is anything but austere. And the mosaics in the background too. Oh, so fabulous. Okay, so traveling down to Thessaloniki in Greece, just to look for a brief second, you can go to the next image. A church known as Saint Demetrios, Saint Demetrios is the patron saint of the city of Thessaloniki. So this is his main shrine in Thessaloniki. This building was built in the 7th century. Let's go to the next image. And it there was a huge fire in the late 19th century. It was mostly reconstructed and a number of the original mosaics were destroyed, but a handful of them, and some really important ones, did survive. And so these provide a really important example of Byzantine images and Byzantine mosaics of saints like Saint Demetrius here. And if we go to the next image, we can see Saint Demetrios again. So you can see a photograph on the left. This panel that you're looking at on the right is over the doorway, just to give you a sense of scale. And notice how his hands are gold. So this is getting into some hagiographic stories about Saint Demetrios. But it gives us a nice indication of what these mosaics were looking like in the era before iconoclasm. So if we go to the next image, we're going to return back to Hagia Sophia and the concept of the triumph of Orthodoxy, which marked the end of iconoclasm. So there was a brief period in the 8th and 9th centuries when you had the banning of religious images in the Byzantine Empire. It's a whole huge topic of discussion. I won't get into it. But when iconoclasm ended, the emperors in Constantinople who ended it were very excited to have images again. And so one of the first images they had put up was in the apse of Hagia Sophia. So if you go to the next image, we can see a detail of the Virgin and Child, which is placed over the apse, the original area of the apse in the building. You can see this otherworldly gold mosaic. And if we go to the next image, we can see the way that this gold and the specific use of mosaic is being exploited here. So one of the things that happens when you're looking at these mosaics that have all of this gold, as we've kind of seen, is that when you look at them from far away, the areas that are not gold seem to fall away and all you see are the gold areas. And so it's interesting to think about what these artists are choosing to highlight with the gold. And here, clearly, it's all about Christ seated within this rich blue, dark background of his mother's lap. You can go to the next image. Hagia Sophia also becomes a really amazing space for the imperial court, so the emperor, the empress, and their family to capitalize on their own power. So just as, or similar to when you have in the ancient Egyptian world, you have different successions of pharaohs adding obelisks to important temple complexes to kind of stake their claim in these important spaces. You have imperial courts in the Byzantine world doing the same at Hagia Sophia. And so this wall here, which if you were standing in this space and you were to look to your left, you would see the apse, and you're on the second floor and you would see down into the altar area. And so here what you have are these portraits of the imperial couples seated with Christ and with the Virgin Mary. So if we go to the next image, we can see a detail of one of them. Yeah, so here we have Constantine IX and his wife, the Empress Zoe. And these images are really fascinating because they are meant to be these perpetual images of the emperor, always there, always present during every liturgical ceremony, right? It's even after they die, they are still there. It's a really interesting way of thinking about the legacy that the Byzantines were thinking about, their own legacy in connection to the Church of Hagia Sophia. If we go to the next image, we can look at the other one. And here we have the Empress John, the Empress, oops, a little typo there, the Emperor John II Komnenos and his wife Empress Irene. And they are on either side of the Virgin Mary, who is holding the Christ child. And that image of the Virgin holding the Christ child is meant to be visually similar to the one that we see in the apse. So it's another way of kind of repeating the images that are already present in this building. Notice the like crazy use of gold, the inclusion of all of these long inscriptions here, which are giving you the names and the titles of these individuals. That M, it looks like an MP, and then sort of a circle with a line through it, and then a V on either side of the halo of the Virgin Mary, are the Greek abbreviations for Mater Theou, which means Mother of God. If we go to the next image, nearby in the same second floor area is this image. It's monumental, it's quite large, and it's an image known as the Diocese, which is a type of iconographic scene where you have Christ in the middle, and you can see him here. If we go to the next image, you can get a better sense because it's got a detail. You can see Christ in the center here, and then on either side of him, he's flanked by the Virgin Mary on the left, so his mother on the left, and his cousin, John the Baptist, on the right. And so this becomes a sort of type of image that you see appearing across Byzantine spaces, across Christian sacred spaces in the Byzantine world, kind of again and again and again. And this one dates to the 13th or 14th century. If we go to the next image, we're still in the city of Constantinople. So where the red arrow is pointing is not what I like to call downtown Constantinople, but it's out on the edge of the city, right next to the city walls. And this is a church known as the Korah Church. And Korah in Greek means like countryside. So it's the church that's out on the countryside. And we can see here, this was dedicated by a man named Medekides in the early 14th century. And if we go inside, go to the next slide. Yeah. So we can see here, and oh my God, there are so many mosaics to look at. So when we look at these mosaics here, and there are mosaics all over the interior of this space, but I just wanted to show you this one. What we have are a dome that has an image of Christ. So at the very center, it's hard to see, but then down below, you have these monumental images of Christ and the Virgin Mary. And if you go to the next image, and the next one. Yeah. So if you go, so now we can see this kind of transformation of mosaics from this kind of these humble origins, at least within a Christian sacred space context, these humble origins where they're in these tiny, and I should mention that image of Christ as Helios from the tomb underneath St. Peter's in the Vatican is very small. When you walk in there, it's a very, very small space to these monumental spaces in the Byzantine world. It's a really remarkable transformation. And so if you go to the next image, I just wanted to leave you with a plug for a book. This is not me. I did not write this book, but Liz James is one of the preeminent art historians who works on Mosaics of Byzantium. So if you're interested in reading more, I would 100% highly recommend her recent book, Mosaics in the Medieval World, to dive into all of the aesthetics of medieval mosaic making. I saw there was a question about how did they make these things. That's kind of a whole separate topic. But yeah, if you're interested in any of that, I would highly recommend that book. So that's what I have for you today. And again, if you all have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Okay. It's been lovely sharing all of this stuff with you.